You know, we're going to be starting a years-long series about the Revolutionary War in the backcountry of South Carolina. And folks call me a historian because that's the short-term version of it. I'm not a historian. I ride the coattails of the true historians. I read the books that the historians write. I'm a student of history, and I'm a battlefield preservationist. And one thing that I've found out, just has kind of fallen into my lap, if you will, just the vast number of Revolutionary War events that happened right here in the backcountry. Now, you're going to hear me talking about the backcountry quite a bit. And primarily, we're talking about the 96th district. We're not necessarily talking about Greenville County, South Carolina, because at that time, this was Cherokee territory. The four westernmost counties in South Carolina, Greenville, Anderson, Pickens, and Oconee counties, were Cherokee territory. It was illegal for any man of European descent to have set foot in this territory unless they had a passport. So while there are just so many Revolutionary War events that happened in the backcountry, there's basically only 3 that happened here in Greenville County. And one of those is we claim Dicey Langston in Traveler's Rest. Now, her primary activities were when she was in Lawrence County, but of course she moved to the Traveler's Rest area and promptly proceeded to have 22 children. So she's famous for that regard, if nothing else. Then we have the site of the Richard Paris homestead and plantation. And you remember I said it was illegal for any person of European descent to be here without a passport, and guess what? Richard Paris did not have a passport. But this Saturday at 10 o'clock, I'm going to give a talk at the east end of the Liberty Bridge, and I would love for everybody to be there then. And we're going to talk about the different activities of Richard Paris. And he was a very influential man in the Revolutionary War in South Carolina. And then the third site that we'll be discussing is where the Battle of the Canebrake in southern Greenville County on the Reedy River. This is the site of the historic Hopkins plantation. And that's one of the sites where I'm the caretaker, and that's where I started my battlefield presentation work. So we'll be visiting that site on September the 11th. Many of these sites are on private property. This is on private property. The landowners are more than happy for me to lead tours anytime, but other than that, it's pretty well, you know, no trespassing, if you will. If y'all want to come in and have a seat real quick.
There's a seat here on the front.
Yeah, there's a few seats here and there.
There are 2 right here.
So, with that in mind, I do want to discuss a little bit of the geography of South Carolina. And some of these slides I'm going to focus on a little bit. Others I'm going to go across real quick because there's a few points that I want to delve in a little bit more detail. But this is the river system of South Carolina, and this was very important during the Revolutionary War. Of course, we know about the Savannah River bordering Georgia. This is the Saluda River, which had good bit of influence, and here's our Reedy River that flows into the Saluda. Right now, this spot here is under Lake Greenwood. The Broad River comes out of North Carolina and heads down to where it joins with the Saluda. This area right here is referred to as the Dutch Fork between the Saluda and the Broad Rivers. The Inaree River we'll talk about, the Tiger River, the Packlet River, these rivers in Spartanburg County. Spartanburg County has 24 significant Revolutionary War events. Lawrence County has 17 significant Revolutionary War events. Within 50 miles of where we are standing right here 112 significant Revolutionary War events. That's from the border to Georgia to the border to North Carolina. No place in America can make that claim. We are right in the heart of it, folks. Oops. Here is the Catawba River. As it passes through the Catawba Indian Reservation, it changes to the Wateree River. This also drains North Carolina as well. When the Wateree and the Congaree River, it's Congaree after Saluda and the Broad join, this is Congaree, Wateree, they join at this point, and then it becomes the Santee River. The Santee River watershed is the second biggest watershed on the East Coast. The Chesapeake Bay is the greatest watershed on the East Coast. And then we have the Petee River over here. In North Carolina, the Petee is referred to as the Yadkin. And a real point of interest that I'll point out now that I've got the rivers up, where Lynch's Creek comes into the Petee is the area where Francis Marion had his hideaway on Snow Island. That was a 7-acre secluded area that the British couldn't figure out where it was till a deserter gave away the location of that spot. Again, while I've got a map of the entire South Carolina, Francis Marion operated in this area. Thomas Sumter operated up into North Carolina and in this area. And then Pickens, Andrew Pickens, operated from North Carolina into Georgia and in the backcountry of South Carolina. South Carolina had the 3 greatest militia generals of any place in the colonies, the United States. Elijah Clark in Georgia, he was a great guy. North Carolina had Charles McDowell and Griffith Rutherford and William R. Davie, who was the founder of University of North Carolina. Virginia had Edward Stevens, but the triumvirate of South Carolina militia generals were the best in the land, and it's something we really should be proud of. I did this all by myself. That's my map making skills. Couldn't find anything that designated. So these were the territories of the Native Americans in South Carolina at first contact and during the Revolutionary War. The Cherokees, this is our area right in through here. The Cherokees were the largest Native American tribe in the southeast. They were 16,000 strong. Their territory extended into northeastern Georgia, western Tennessee, or eastern Tennessee, and western North Carolina, up and through this area here. The Catawbas also controlled a large area from Camden all the way up into North Carolina as well. And then at first contact, the Yamasee were down here along the coast, and there were about 20 smaller Native American tribes in the coastal area. These were, poorly organized and so forth. The Cherokees were the most organized. The Creeks were in Georgia, Alabama, and northern Florida. The Seminoles were a Creek tribe. They had a greater geographic area than the Cherokees, but there were less of the Creeks. And the Creek name, they didn't call themselves Creek. That was what Europeans, that was a name that they gave them. One thing to keep in mind is that the Catawbas and the Cherokees were bitter enemies throughout. And if the Catawbas were allies with one group, the Cherokees were against them, and vice versa. We consider the border between the Cherokees and the Catawbas to be the Broad River, which would have been about through there. This is first contact. The first contact with the Native American tribes and the European culture occurred in Winyah Bay in 1524. That's when Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, if I pronounced that right, Spaniard, sailed into Winyah Bay, which is where Georgetown is, in 1524, and he promptly proceeded to capture 60 Winyah Indians and deliver them into slavery in the Caribbean islands. So this was first contact. De Ayllon came back 2 years later and brought 600 settlers. We don't exactly know where his settlement was, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Within 6 months, 500 of those settlers, including de Ayllon, were dead, and primarily from smallpox. 1540, Hernando Soto comes through the state looking for, City of Gold and so forth. And the Spaniards came as conquerors. They just decimated the Northern American tribes as they came through. You could not have worse ambassadors for European culture than the Spaniards. They poisoned the relationship between the Native Americans and the European culture for the next 120 years. Now, perhaps if the English had come first, they would have done the same things. I blame the Spaniards for everything, as you can tell. They started it off bad. And then when the Revolutionary War came, this was 100 years into a terrible period of just retaliation and retribution. Who started this? Who started that? There was such a conflict of cultures between the Native Americans and the Europeans, and I'm going to get into that a little bit deeper later on. But those two groups could not understand each other. What made perfect sense to the Native Americans made absolutely no sense to the Europeans, and time after time, that lack of understanding had very deadly results. When first contact was made, it's estimated that there were 10 million Native Americans in North America. By the time of the Revolutionary War, there were 1 million Native Americans. And smallpox is the biggest reason why there was such a decimation of Native American culture. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts in 1620, they called Massachusetts the land of skulls and bones. There were not enough living people left to bury the dead people. And this is in 1620. This is the Yamasee War. I'm going to go over this quick. I want you to know that there was a war between the Yamasee tribe and the settlers along the coast, which was primarily just Charlestown. 7% of the European population was killed during the Yamasee War. The Cherokees and the Catawbas were involved. They switched sides back and forth. It was a confusing time, but this is part of the first beginning of the troubles with the Native Americans. Pardon the fuzziness here, but in 1739 there was a slave revolt. The only slave revolt in South Carolina, and it was a very troubling time for the plantation owners. This happened on the Stono River, plantation on the Stono River. The slave traders had captured a slave. There's two different names. One of them says his name was Cato, and the other one says his name was Jimmy, Jemmy. This Jimmy came from the Congo, which was Portuguese territory at that time. And the Portuguese were Catholic, so Jimmy was Catholic. And the British colonists just abhorred Catholicism. There was a major fight going on between the English crown and the Catholics during that time. And also Jimmy could read and write, which was another thing that the British colonists absolutely abhorred. Jimmy was charismatic. He banded together with 50 slaves and they revolted. 2 plantations were wiped out. And then Jimmy and his followers headed south to Florida. There would be sanctuary in Florida. They made it 50 miles away until they were captured by the local militia. And so the 50 slaves were bound, and they marched them back. At every mile, they beheaded one of the slaves and put the head on a pike. And they did this mile after mile after mile as a warning to the slaves as far as revolting was concerned. And this Stono Rebellion has been on the minds of the plantation owners in South Carolina ever since. And this is how militias formed in the Low Country as a response to a possible slave uprising. Militias formed in the Backcountry in response to Cherokee depredations. So the British colonists, they were worried about Native American uprisings, they were worried about slave uprisings, and they were worried about the French. So, and this is during a time where the British and French were engaged in 5 major wars over a 100-year period. So this was a continuing battle with the French. So, you know, the blue shows the area of control by the French. This is a very misleading map. The French had New Orleans and they had Montreal and Quebec. And yes, they did have control and influence in this area, but there were only 30,000 Frenchmen in North America at this time. There were 2 million British colonists. Now you can see this is a light brown over here. These areas were controlled by the Spanish in 1750. The gray area here, that's Indian Territory. And you can see how the corner there of South Carolina is in Indian Territory. And then, you know, Georgia, there was only 30% of Georgia was colonized at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. There were only 2 towns in Georgia. That was Savannah and Augusta. The Savannah River is navigable to Augusta. There was a little bitty port called Sunbury that the British had, but I don't think Sunbury even exists to this day. Other things I'd like to point out, because, you know, the British really were worried about the French quite a bit. As a response to British or French influence, the British did build a fort, Fort Prince George, in the Cherokee lower town capital of Kiowee. The Cherokees had the lower town Cherokees, the middle town Cherokees, and the overhill Cherokees. These groups spoke different dialects, but they did all have the Cherokee clan system, which I'm going to describe in detail in a little bit. So in addition to the fort here at Fort Prince George at Kiowee, the British also built a fort here in eastern Tennessee, Fort Loudon. This was on the Little Tennessee River, and this was to counter French influence. Fort Kiowee was also a trading center with the Cherokees. There was a love-hate relationship between the Cherokees and the British colonists. The Cherokees absolutely depended on European goods for survival as soon as they made contact. I mean, hunting knives, pots and pans, muskets, you name it. The Cherokees were a Stone Age culture. They had no metal tools. They had no beast of burden. Until European settlement occurred. The British colonists depended on deerskins from the Cherokees. 50,000 deer skins a year left from the port of Charleston going to England to be finished. You know, England was taking raw products from America, taking them to England, manufacturing those goods, and then selling them back to America as well. England had it going on as far as their trade with North America, and England established a monopoly. England was at odds with everybody else in the world except the German principalities. Spain, Holland, France were all enemies of England. Well, what did I do? The colonists along the coast, this was one of their main, if not the main issue that they had with the English government. It soon became apparent how profitable it was to grow rice along the South Carolina tidal rivers. Huge plantations evolved from the rice planters, and an aristocracy arose among the rice planters. These were the rice kings. These plantations would have hundreds of slaves and create a tremendous amount of wealth. Charleston was the wealthiest city in North America during this time. And the British colonial policy restricted that trade. They would only let the South Carolina rice kings sell to England. They could not sell to the Caribbean. They couldn't sell to the French. They couldn't buy from the French. So this was a major bone of contention with the South Carolina aristocracy leading up to the Revolutionary War. After the French and Indian War occurred, it was the 7 Years' War in France, when Prussia attacked Austria. Started a major battle in France, the 7 Years' War, with England against France and Spain and Holland and all the rest of them. There were set-piece European battles during that time with armies of 100,000 each fighting against each other. Well, all during those wars, not a single square inch of territory exchanged hands. It stayed static exactly the way it was at the end of the 7 Years' War. However, there were major changes in North America. The French lost all of this. The Spaniards lost Florida. For 200 years, the Spaniards had been in Florida. They were given 12 months to leave and go to Havana. So then Florida was given to the English. Florida at this time was divided into two different colonies, West Florida and East Florida. West Florida, the capital was Pensacola. East Florida, the capital was St. Augustine. And there were only, at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, there were only 1,000 British subjects in East Florida and 1,000 in West Florida. Florida changed hands 4 times in the 60-year period that we're talking about here. The Spaniards kept this area and they took over Louisiana as well. And the British took Canada, and this area was just kind of left open. There was very few people that were there anyway. So that was the end result of the French and Indian War. So part of what happened during the French and Indian War was the attempt to take Fort Duquesne. This is Fort Duquesne at the junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers in Pittsburgh, which formed the Ohio River. Fort Duquesne controlled travel on those 3 different rivers. Until Richard Parris showed up with 300 Overhill Cherokees. Now, there was an earlier attempt in 1754 to take Fort Duquesne by General Braddock, and it was a disastrous defeat by the British forces. George Washington fought in that battle. George Washington was a 21-year-old officer at that time, and because he was so young and inexperienced, he was given the job of looking after the reserves and the wagon train and so forth that was Braddock and his soldiers were depending on. He was a rear guard. And as Braddock and his men were retreating, Washington stood firm and prevented even worse defeat. But when Richard Parrish showed up on the scene with his Cherokee warriors, and you could tell these are Cherokee. If you look, Cherokees had a distinctive hairstyle. They would shave their heads around here and just had a top knot with a single feather. Anytime you see that, you know you're looking at Cherokee. Cherokees shaved the sides of their heads with clamshells that they imported from the coast. That shows how the trade was back and forth. But here we are, Richard Parris and the Cherokees capturing Fort Duquesne, which was a major British victory. They were British allies. And what happened as a result of the events at Fort Duquesne led to absolute calamity for the Cherokees. And this is an illustration of the way that these two cultures could not understand each other. Cherokee culture is based on the clan system. Cherokee culture is matrilineal. You belong to the clan of your mother. In the Cherokee culture, there were 7 clans, and any town that had all 7 clans present was a healthy, strong town. You had like the Paint clan, the Wolf clan, the Bird clan, and so forth. There were several, the Deer clan, there were several different kinds. The clan system absolutely regulated Cherokee society for centuries. And it kind of made a lot of sense, especially to them. Didn't make any sense to the Europeans, but it made a lot of sense to the Cherokees. So when a Cherokee maiden was looking for a husband at the age of 12, she would choose a husband. The wife chose the husband. She would choose a husband that she felt like would strengthen the clan. Her obligation was to produce a strong clan. And it did not matter if the husband was an absolute degenerate alcoholic or anything like that. If he had the physical attributes, she wanted that man for her husband. And the reason is, in the Cherokee culture, fathers did not raise their children. So what do we think about as Europeans? Fathers do not raise their children. The children are raised by the mother's brothers who are in her clan. And a Cherokee wife, if she ever got tired of her husband, she could divorce him right away. It just took a flick of her wrist. And that guy, he had to go back to his clan. So, this was the system as how it worked. And just a further illustration of that, you hear about the promiscuity of the Cherokee maidens and so forth. Well, they definitely had their taboos. They could not marry anybody that was a member of their own clan. They had to choose for a husband somebody who was outside the clan, or if they were English, well, that was fine too. Particularly because they thought that if they had relations with an Englishman, that they would be more immune to smallpox. and European diseases. So it was absolutely taboo for a maiden to have a husband from her own clan or her father's clan. And what this did was it absolutely prevented incest. So here's how Cherokee tribal law applied to what was going on with this clan system. If somebody in the Paint clan, and there were very few transgressions that would be punished. You know, the Cherokees believed in absolute ultimate freedom. They did not believe that one person had the right to tell another person what to do. They did not believe that. And that even applied to the children. They didn't tell the children what to do. No Cherokee child was ever spanked. They weren't. And the children were allowed just to do whatever. If they were playing too close to the fire, once they got burned, if they didn't learn then, stay away from the fire, you know, that was it. So if you broke the rules of the clan, and the clans had specific rules, you know, one of their punishments would have been shunning, and they wouldn't talk to the person, and the person would have to, you know, get by without anybody talking to him. Or they could be banished. They had those transgressions. But if you murdered somebody, say if a member of the Paint clan murdered another member of the Paint clan, then it's up to the Paint clan to decide to deal with that transgression. And maybe it was self-defense or whatever. Maybe the guy needed to be murdered. I don't know. Maybe there wouldn't be any punishment, or maybe the murderer would be killed. It was an eye for an eye. That was their system of justice. So if a member of the Paint clan killed a member of the Wolf clan, then it's up to the Wolf clan to decide on the punishment. They could kill that member of the Paint clan, and that would be the end of it. Or they could kill anybody in the Paint clan of equal rank. So what that meant was, if somebody from the Paint clan killed somebody from the Wolf clan, and then that killer left and went down to Florida, well, he left knowing that a member of his clan was going to be killed in his place. So this was how they regulated their society. So here we are with the 300 Overhill Cherokee warriors defeating Fort Duquesne. So there's a couple of different stories about what happened here, but one of the stories is that while they were in that area, some settlers from Virginia stole their horses. They stole 30 horses. So the Cherokees go to the people in Virginia and say, we had 30 horses stolen. What clan did the people belong to that stole those horses? And the Virginia settlers look at them and say, clan? We ain't got no stinking clans. We're all one clan. And so to the Cherokee thinking, so there's all just one clan. So any retribution that they take against the members of that clan is totally justified. So as they're traveling back and they're going through North Carolina, the Cherokees confiscate 30 horses. And there's one thing about North Carolinians, they do not like horse thieves. And so a battle, you know, started back and forth. And 22 North Carolinians were killed. And the Cherokees got back home. And the governor of North Carolina and South Carolina got together and say, you've got to give us 22 members of your tribe, and we're going to hang them. It was a demand for blood. And if you don't turn over 22 members to us, we're not going to trade with you. We're going to embargo you. And, you know, that went on for a few months and everything, and the Cherokees were suffering. as a result. So they sent a delegation of about 25 or 30 of the leading men of the Cherokees down to talk to the governor in South Carolina. And he says, no, you got to give us 22 people. You got to turn over 22. You got to turn over 22. And they said, oh, what are we going to do? They were down there under a white flag. The Cherokees knew what a white flag was. So then the governor says, no, just go back home, and you're not going to get any trade goods from us until you turn over the 22 people. But I will give you a military escort back to Kiowa, because the people in the backcountry are really upset with you, and they'll probably kill you if I don't give you this escort. So these Cherokee chiefs or leading men were escorted back, and about the time they got around Orangeburg, the military escort decides to capture those leading men who were down there under a white flag. So they were marched back to Fort Prince George in Kiowa with their hands bound behind their back. They were thrown into the guard room at Fort Prince George, which was only built for 6 people, and they had 25 of them in there. And this went on for a few months. And finally the Cherokees set out another white flag and said, we want to negotiate. Let's talk about this. And Lieutenant Coitmore, who was he was in charge of Fort Prince George, he went out to talk to the Cherokees. Well, as he was out there talking to them on the banks of the Kiowa River, the warriors rose up and they shot and they killed Lieutenant Coitmore. Well, the war was on when that happened. All the hostages that were in Fort Prince George, they were killed immediately. The Cherokees surrounded Fort Prince George, and they were besieged for several weeks until the relief columns could come from Charleston. And Archibald Montgomery, led a column of 1,000 or so men up to relieve Fort Prince George. And when he got there, he was able to relieve that fort. Fort Prince George was saved. But in the meantime, Fort Loudon, which was in Tennessee, on the Little Tennessee River, 150 miles away, they were surrounded by the Overhill Cherokees up there. And Archibald Montgomery marched up in the Franklin area, which again is part of the Cherokee Path. He got to a pass called Echoe, E-C-H-O-E. And it was a very narrow defile with steep mountainsides, and there was a battle there, and Montgomery was defeated. And he could not relieve Fort Loudon. And the commander of Fort Loudon had a negotiation with the Overhill Cherokees and said, look, if we leave our weapons behind, will you let us travel to Fort Prince George? And the Cherokees said, sure, go ahead. Yeah. So the garrison from Fort Loudon left and started marching back to Fort Prince George. Well, again, stories vary, but one of the stories is that the British force had buried weapons in the floor of the fort. And after the garrison got about 15 or 20 miles away, those hidden weapons were discovered, and to the Cherokee mind, the deal was off. And so they surrounded the soldiers there, and one story says they were all slaughtered at that time. Another one says about 23 were killed. The commander of the fort, a fellow named Demir, he was scalped alive, and he had other tortures he had to endure, and he was forced to dance till he died. And after he died, the Cherokees stuffed dirt into his mouth, saying, if you're so hungry for land, here, eat all you want. So I see a few pained looks on a few faces with that story. And I'm telling you, we are talking about an extremely brutal time. And there's going to be lots of stories like that. And I can tone this down if you want me to. But I want you to realize from all of these stories that I'm going to be talking about with Cherokee depredations and retaliations, I mean, some of the worst brutalities and massacres in the Revolutionary War happened within 20 miles of here. Hayes Station, for instance. Any story I tell you like that, I want you to realize I'm actually holding back details as well. So that is an example of the thought processes and the reasons for the conflicts that happened between the Cherokees and the settlers. You know, there was two different sets of issues in South Carolina during the Revolutionary War. For the Rice Kings along the coast, their issues with England were mercantile. For the settlers in the backcountry, the issues were not with the British, they were with the Cherokees. And as far as the Cherokees are concerned, there were all kinds of evilness that was happening in the backcountry. And it could have been Shawnees from Ohio. They came down through here on a raiding party at one time. Or it could have been Creeks from Georgia. Or it could have been white men dressed as Indians, which was a favorite thing for them to do. But whoever it was that was committing depredations, the Cherokees got blamed for it. So another thing, I mean, several things I want you to keep in mind as we go through this discussion about the South Carolina backcountry in the Revolutionary War. The backcountry was divided. This was a civil war. Half of the inhabitants here were loyalists. Well, one author says 1/3 of the backcountry was loyalist, and 1/3 of the backcountry was patriots, and 1/3 just could care less who won. The overriding concern was protection from the Cherokees. If you thought that the British colonial government could give you better protection from the Cherokees, then you would become a loyalist. If you thought that the local patriot militia was the best defense against the Cherokees, then you became a patriot. Or if your neighbor stole your girlfriend away from you and he was a patriot, you became a Tory. There were so many personal animosity that decided who was going to be a Tory or a loyalist. This was an incredibly brutal time. The bravery of the backcountry settlers is unsurpassed. They never went to bed at night knowing if they were going to be waking up the next morning, literally. They didn't know if they were going to go to bed at night and there's going to be a flaming arrow shot into the roof of their house that night. So a lot of animosity, was in the backcountry. And like I say, it was a civil war. And I'm going to be describing some very ugly scenes. I'm going to be talking about American history here, warts and all. The Patriots, they weren't saints. It was hard to be a saint in a situation like that. And as much strife and turmoil as occurred back then, this boiling cauldron of hate that was going on, and it really was. That's what it took to create the birth of our nation. And of all the ugly things that I'm going to be describing, I want you to know that I'm a proud Greenvillian, I'm a proud South Carolinian, and I'm a proud American. But again, it took this horrible strife to produce what I feel like is the greatest document that mankind has ever produced. and that's the Constitution of the United States. Of all the conflicts that we had, the Constitution is the end result. And for 235 years, that Constitution has stood strong, longer than any other constitutional democracy in the world. And the Constitution is not perfect. The Founding Fathers knew that it wasn't perfect. The definition of words has changed over the past 235 years. But the mechanism for change is there. So I want you to realize that of all the ugliness that I do talk about, in the end result, you know, we're much better off for that. So that's the French and Indian War. These are land grants, townships that the British colonial government established as a shield for what was happening down in the country, down in the low country. These are townships that were created to prevent Indian attacks from coming in. This was about 1750. So after the French and Indian War, there was a treaty in 1755. This is actually before the French and Indian War started, and that was the Treaty of Saludo. And the Treaty of Saludo was actually one of the treaties with the Cherokees, and there were 32 treaties with the Cherokees, and the treaties with the Cherokees were ridiculous on both ends. You could not make a treaty with the Cherokees because they had no central government whatsoever. You make a treaty with one group that had no bearing whatsoever on the other groups that did not sign off on the treaty. And the same problem applied to the European settlers. South Carolina could make a treaty with the lower town Cherokees, but that did not mean that Virginia was bound by that treaty to the Overhill Cherokees. So the treaties were a joke for the most part. Cherokees were giving away land in West Virginia. Well, guess what? The Cherokees weren't in West Virginia. That happened in Greenwood, the Treaty of Hard Labor in Greenwood. But the Treaty of Saluda in 1755 was actually one of the treaties that was honored. And during that time, this area right here was allocated to European settlement by the Cherokees. And it was sold. And the sale price was, every fall, the colonial government would send a shipment of shot and powder to the Cherokee lower town in Kiowee. And the Cherokees needed that for their winter hunt. And they would shoot the deer and send the deer skins down to Charleston. So everybody was happy with this arrangement, except that the borders of this area were not defined at all. This border where the Broad River was defined, but there was no concrete definition of who owned what. The Long Cane community was right in here. The Long Cane community was a wealthy farmland because at that spot, the river crane would grow 30 feet tall. And European settlers realized early on that anywhere that river cane grew, corn would grow. River cane and corn are both in the grass family. The Reedy River is named after river cane. It was thick and it was choked with river cane. But when you burn that cane off, you can grow corn as well as you want. And that's why the area right in here, which was the Long Canes community, became wealthy. But the the Cherokees were thinking that that was their property. And that's where the Long Cane massacre occurred in 1760, when the first Cherokee War that I described earlier when that occurred. This line here was established in 1763 with the Treaty of Augusta, which ended the First Cherokee War, or the Anglo-Cherokee War. And this line was defined as from a point at DeWitt's Corner. DeWitt's Corner was the westernmost point that was surveyed in South Carolina at that time. Surveying was very important. It was we did not have survey points to deal with. So a line was drawn from southwest to the Savannah River, northeast to the Reedy River. So that's when this line came in. This line right now is the border between Abbeville County and Anderson County. And it is also the line between Lawrence County and Greenville County. So later in 1793, the residents in this area around the Enoree decided that they wanted to be part of Greenville County. So this area right here is now part of Greenville County. But this line here this point was surveyed and defined. In 1766, the governor of North Carolina, Lord Tryon, he's looking at this area here, and he decides that he wants to claim the area from here to the Catawba tribe, which was here, the Catawba Reservation, which was also established in 1763 because the Catawbas aided the British during the First Cherokee War. Lord Tryon claimed this area right here for North Carolina. For 6 years, Spartanburg County was in North Carolina. South Carolina protested that, and there was a court trial to determine who owned that spot of land. And the court trial was in London. And 6 years later, they came back with the decision that no, this is South Carolina after all. And this area was referred to as the new acquisition. South Carolina was supposed to go up this way to the 35th parallel and then come across, but the surveyor on this line in 1730, about right there, he ran into a moonshine still, and that's where it ended. But I got lots of stories like that too. But this line between Greenville County and Spartanburg County, it was drawn by the governor of North Carolina in the 1760s. So one thing the Treaty of Saludo did, 1755, was it opened this area up for European settlement. This area right here was the frontier of America. We had gone as far as we could to the Appalachian Mountains. The British forces, British government forbade European settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So there was no area left around Pennsylvania, Virginia, and so forth, except for this area right here due south. And the Great Wagon Trail came down into this area, and all of a sudden this area was opened up for pioneer settlement. It was the frontier of America. And many great people came to this area. And also many of the worst sorts of mankind came to this area. And there was no judicial system here. If you had a complaint against your neighbor who stole your horse, you had to take a week-long journey down to Charleston, file a complaint, and then take another week going back. That's 2 weeks out of your life to deal with somebody who stole your horse, or there was a land dispute, or who knows what. So after a while, in the 1760s, the settlers here got pretty tired of that. and they decided to take matters into their own hands. And a movement arose which was called the Regulator Movement. And the Regulator Movement, actually what it was a vigilante group. And if they figured that a certain fellow was a horse thief, well, they would take him, they would tie him to a tree, and then they would whip him till they felt like he was properly punished. And this went on for a while, and the Regulator Movement got out of hand. And it got so out of hand that another movement arose in opposition to it. And that was the moderator movement. And the moderators and the regulators had such organized forces that they faced off against each other and almost came to blows. But Colonel Richard Richardson from the Camden area came and he talked to both groups, and through the force of his will, he calm the situation down. The Regulators movement was a successful movement, and the reason it was successful is that the colonial government knew that there was a problem back here, and they established a courthouse and jail in '96, which was the most prosperous area in the backcountry of South Carolina. '96 had 12 houses. During this time, Charlotte had 20. So, that's how it was back in the backcountry. The government built a 3-story structure made of brick. It was the grandest structure in the backcountry. And the backcountry settlers would come from miles around, and they would stand there and they would just look at that building. It was the jail. And they had a courthouse as well. But that's what established the 96th district. Well, it's 1 o'clock now. I think we'll, kind of wind things up now. If anybody has to leave for an appointment or work or something like that, feel free to. But I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody may have at this point.
Where did the 96 name come from?
The thought is that it's 96 miles from Kiowee, and that an Indian maiden rode the 96 miles to warn her English lover of an Indian attack. And as this maiden left by, she named other sites in the South Carolina backcountry, such as 6 Mile, 3 and 20 Creek, 1 Mile, 12 Mile Creek, things of that nature. But I measured how far it is from Kiowee to 96. It's 73 miles. That term has kind of been lost to history.
Is Kiowee still there?
Kiowee is underwater. Kiowee is at the bottom of Lake Kiowee. It was extensively studied in the early 60s, archaeological studies. We know exactly where the fort is and what the dimensions were and that sort of thing, but it is totally underwater.
Tell me again where we meet on Saturday and what time.
Okay, on Saturday, we're meeting at the east end of the Liberty Bridge. Everybody knows where the Liberty Bridge is. It's on the far side, the side opposite Main Street. We're meeting there at 10 o'clock, and we're going to discuss the life and times of Richard Paris.
That's the bulwark side.
I couldn't answer that. It's the other side of the Liberty Bridge. Well, I thank you for your attention. Appreciate everybody coming.